Hey guys, hope you're doing well. People always say that Quebec City is the most European city in North America. And I just got back from Quebec City. It was my first time. And if you know anything about me, you know that I spend a lot of time in Europe. If you're new here, hi, my name is Camden. I move to a new country every single month. Been doing that for a little over 3 years now, and a lot of that is in Europe. A lot of that time is spent in Europe. So I was really excited to finally get to Quebec City. As somebody who has grown up in America, thinking that we have a place that is close to being European just north was really exciting. So I have a lot of thoughts. Some things I want to break down for you, and this is the Unfiltered series, so this is just my raw, unfiltered thoughts. What you're looking at is what you're going to be looking at for the next 15, 20 minutes, however long I ramble. So settle in, and I have a lot of questions. Actually, not a lot of questions. I have a very pointed question for locals, and it'll make sense in a minute. So I might glance down every now and then. I have a general idea of where I'm going to take you, but let's kind of unpack this place. First piece is, okay, does it actually feel European? The answer is yes, but I think it's important to ask, like, okay, what makes a place feel European? Like, what was I looking for? What did I notice? And where did it not so much feel European? And I think for me, it kind of breaks down into like three categories. The first thing that makes something feel European is just simply the architecture. Does it have that old world feel, or is it more modern? And it's not to say that you don't have modern architecture in Europe. You certainly do. But in general, I think when people think about Europe in the old world, that's maybe the word they think is old world, right? A lot of stone and just these really old, beautiful buildings. Things just look pretty, that old worldy feel. And that is very much present in Quebec City. So check number one, feels European in that way. Second way is just what you hear, which I feel like, I see if this resonates with you, and tell me if it doesn't. For me, so much of Europe is what I hear, in that typically a European town is focused on walking culture, which very much exists in Quebec City, especially in that Old Town area. You're not hearing so much cars, you're hearing feet hitting the ground because there's a lot of people walking. You hear, spillover of conversations because you can hear over, the cars because they're not there. So you can hear people having conversations. There's just a quietness and a sound where the energy is coming from people rather than from machines. Is that fair to say? Does that kind of draw that comparison between the U.S.? Like in the U.S., you're used to hearing cars. You're used to hearing, people honking the horns. Maybe it's the street lights, ticking that you got 20 seconds to run across the street, right? That sort of thing I don't associate with Europe. I associate with the U.S. And many other places around the world, because in Europe you have that slower pace and you hear things from people rather than from things that people create. I think I did that one. So that's thing number two, which is present in Quebec City. Third thing for me, which maybe this one's a little bit of a reach, is the smell. There is something distinctly different about European culture in terms of like what they're cooking and how people interact with stores, right? In the U.S. and in many other places, you have restaurants and you have grocery stores, and that is kind of it. In Europe, you have real cafe culture, right? Like you always have people who they come back from their Europe trip and they're like, I'm trying to recreate, European cafe culture here in America, and they're showing them, sitting outside at a Starbucks, and it's like it's not the same, right? The visuals aren't the same, the sounds definitely aren't the same, the smells aren't the same. Like everything's different, and smell is a big one for me as a foodie. I'm based in Montreal right now. The reason that relates is I'm trying to get around to the food is different in Quebec City. And just like up in this region, that French influence was it was spectacular. Love that. And that is something that, again, from a smell perspective, I feel like you could drop me in the European cities that I know well, and you could drop me pretty much anywhere in the US, and I feel like I could just smell whether I'm in Europe or the US. I could be completely off. Maybe I'm just nuts, but I really feel like those are three main things that like I really do think are some key distinctions between Europe and North America. Having said that, Quebec City definitely aligns with the European values and feel in that regard. But as somebody who's been privileged enough to spend quite a bit of time in Europe, I definitely saw some differences as well that I want to share and just, again, see if anybody else is picking up on these. The biggest one for me is around the walking culture and just where people hang out. And this is where a question is going to come in for the locals. Quebec City is wonderful. That old town is beautiful. It is charming. But to me, it felt really touristy. And what I mean by that is it's simply just where the tourists hang out. It didn't necessarily feel to me like locals were hanging out in those areas. And one of the things that is unique and that I love about Europe is that the downtown, the core, the heart of the cities, well, yes, you're definitely going to have some tourists in those European destinations. Local life intersects there. It happens. You will have locals in the heart of those cities or close to it. Meaning, when you're in Europe, you don't have to venture too far to find the local culture. Quebec City felt a little bit different in that it was hard to distinguish whether or not there were locals hanging out in the old town or if they were elsewhere. And for context, I'm somebody who, because of the way that I travel, which I recognize is kind of weird, like some people call me a tourist, some people say that I live there short term. Like I don't really know how I define it myself. I'm typically in a place for a month, which means I'm not staying in hotels. I rent an apartment in a local area. I seek the local culture. That's just what I'm in it for. So there's nothing wrong with tourism. There's nothing wrong with touristy areas. It's just not what I'm looking for when I'm traveling somewhere. And touristy areas can be great because if you're a tourist, well, hey, the touristy areas because they're catering to you, right? They want to make things as simple, as comfortable, just as easy as possible for you. Again, I'm seeking something a little bit different, and that's going to be different for everybody. But my point with this is, in Quebec City, it felt like it was a little bit harder to distinguish that culture of locals versus tourists because the old town, which I think is what 99% of people are talking about when they talk about Quebec City and it being very similar to Europe, that's the area that I think they're talking about. So from a look, from a feel, sound, smell kind of thing, it's present. But in terms of the people living there, I don't know that I have a solid conclusion there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So a question for locals: if you're somebody who lives in Quebec City, I recognize that Quebec City, the old town itself, is not all of Quebec City. Do you, as locals who do not live in the old town, do you spend much time there? Like, do you go down to Old Town on a weekly basis? If so, what for? Is it to eat? Is it to do any shopping? I imagine maybe not. I'd just be curious to know because there's so many beautiful things that I could see locals enjoying, but at the same time, typically locals try to avoid the areas where there's tourists. And a good example is like New York, right? You ask any New Yorker, hey, were you in Times Square last week? And they're going to be like, no, like why would I ever be in Times Square, right? That is the last place that, somebody from New York wants to be. Same way that the last place that somebody from Los Angeles wants to be is Hollywood Walk of Fame. You're just not going to catch many locals hanging out in those areas, right? So I'm curious, do you guys hang out in Old Town Quebec City, or is that just for the tourists? So that's kind of where a lot of my questions and just reflections have been is Quebec City, that old town that does feel European, is that a facade or just real in those few blocks because it is small, or does that spill over to the rest? Because I did hang out outside of the old town and I really enjoyed it, but it did have a different feel. It definitely at that point felt more North American, less European. So again, not to say that it didn't feel European, but it just felt less so. So it's hard to make that distinction. Anyways, looking down because again, the points. Oh, one thing that caught me off guard. Yeah, this was my own fault. the hills are real. I don't know why. In doing the research, like I should have recognized, like, oh, they're talking about upper and lower town. That probably means there's a hill. That didn't click for me. Shows you my American brain working. The hills caught me off guard. Nothing too important there, just something that I thought I'd mention. They're pretty real there. One of the things that I loved was just how easy it was to access Quebec City in two ways. The first, coming from Montreal, it was a piece of cake. That definitely felt European in hopping on a train and getting dropped off pretty close to, the old town, and all of a sudden being here in a couple hours. That is something that I have always wished was a part of U.S. culture, and I get for a million reasons that probably won't ever be in my lifetime, unfortunately, but I love European train culture. Loved getting here from Montreal. It was a piece of cake, felt European. One of the other things that I really loved, I don't know, I just love anywhere that I can walk. And I felt like it was very walkable. But I feel like that's tying me back into the other point. And there is another important point to make. A couple of this one random thing. This is just an observation. It's kind of unrelated, and then I'll get back to the main point. The sensors. When you're crossing a street, sometimes you push a button. Sometimes it's automatic. You're trying to indicate to the street, hey, I'm here. I want to walk there. So please stop traffic for me. I had never seen the things that are in Quebec City, the little, I'm just going to call them sensors. It feels like it's a no touch. You just kind of wave your hand underneath. There's some confusion around that. Again, probably my small American brain at work there, but thought it was something to mention. But okay, my other big takeaway, which is so, I don't know how to feel about it because I don't want this to be taken out of context. So I'll start with just the blunt, honest truth. And that is, I don't know that Quebec City is a place that I will go back to without good reason. And there's a lot to unpack there. A lot of it comes down to my privilege. Truly, me having the opportunity to spend as much time in Europe as I do probably skews things quite a bit for me. Really enjoyed Quebec City, and I would say that it is definitely a place that people should see. And I'm very glad that I went, especially because I was based here in Montreal. It'd be ridiculous not to. Having said that, it's obviously clear that in this video I've talked about some of the ways that Quebec City didn't completely feel European. And it's so hard if you're chasing that European feel, that European dream, something that I'm addicted to it at this point. I love the European culture. It is hard to replace it with anything but the real thing. So it's not a knock on Quebec City. It's a fundamentally different place. It takes some of the best elements of Europe, but there's also Canadian influence and just a different culture. Some things are wonderful that they've brought over, like the food. Oh, don't even get me started on the food. I'm going to be talking a lot about that in my Montreal series. And in some of the other things, some of the best food in North America is up in this region. But having the opportunity to be in Europe so much, it's hard to reasonably say, yeah, I'm going to pick Quebec City over going to Europe if I have the opportunity to go to Europe. So it's not to say that there's anything wrong with Quebec City. It's just, I think that's a truth for me, and I think Sarah felt a similar way. And I've talked to some other folks who also feel the same way. So I imagine it's a place that I will go back to if I'm up here in Montreal again. Certainly take the train over just to, hang out maybe for a quick weekend trip. If family or friends wanted to meet up in Quebec City and they wanted to see it, I'd be happy to meet up with them there. If there was some work event, something to draw me there, I'm not going to be disappointed ever about going to Quebec City. But if you ask me, hey, the world is your oyster, you can kind of go where you want. Where's Quebec City rank? When's the next time you're going? I don't know that it's a place that I have plans to go back to without there being a plan, if that makes sense, right? In other words, I'm not going for the destination. I'd be going for something else. The destination is a cherry on top. So I'd be curious to know if you are somebody who's been to Quebec City, does that make sense? And do you feel similar in that so glad that you did it, but it's not a high repeatable place for you because so much of the beauty is that European culture. And if you have the ability to go to Europe, that might be what you want to go do. I really feel like that is, again, a truth for me at this point. So I'd be curious to get your take, on that. But it really does feel European in many ways, and it was special, and it's so cool. If you've been following along on my story, you know that we've been doing some Canada travel over the last few months. My wife is actually from Canada. She's from the Toronto area, so we did Vancouver, we've done Toronto before. We're in Montreal right now, Quebec City. So loved spending our time up in Canada. The people here are just so wonderful, and that is something that I did notice in Quebec City that I loved and was definitely had that European flair, which is going to come up in the tips video for Quebec City for first timers, because I will have that coming out next week, is just the French culture. I recognize that they are different cultures, being Quebec City and actual France, and there's so many different cultures just within France itself. But one of the things that I love and don't necessarily love about the US is there's just a certain level of what I'll call respect that occurs in Europe and in French culture. Like if you walk in somewhere and don't start with a, bonjour to whoever is, working at the store or working at the restaurant, or whoever, right? Like it's just proper to greet somebody and say hello, like in their language. That seemed to spill over in Quebec City. It wasn't that American way where it's like, hey, my goal is to get in and out with ever talking to anybody. So that was nice to see. But I hope all this made sense. Again, if you're a local, I would love to know, again, how much time do you spend, if at all, in the old town? Do you feel like I'm on base with anything? And a big question for you locals, if you've had the opportunity to go to Europe, how do you feel about your own town, being Quebec City, compared to Europe? What was it like going to Europe for you? And does anything that I've mentioned in the past 10, 15, I don't know how long I've been rambling, does any of that resonate with you? I'm curious on that. But yeah, I know this has been a bit more rambly, a lot of me asking questions. I think it's just because I have a lot of questions after Quebec City, but point being, I loved my time. I appreciate you guys as always for watching. Looking forward to reviewing the comments. And again, that Quebec City tips video, it will be live. It'll be right here once it is ready. That's the tips for all the first timers, what you want to know before you go. So be sure to check that out. I'll catch you guys next time. And as always, hope you have a great day.